Sansa Stark sat at her vanity in the small, cramped bedchamber within the Red Keep, listening to the distant raucous of bells echoing across King's Landing. The city hummed with an undercurrent of tension and festivities, a strange mixture she could almost taste on her tongue. Tomorrow was King Joffrey's wedding to Marjorie Tyrell. It would be a lavish affair, a day filled with fanfare, golden cloaks lining the cobbled streets, and the roar of cheers from crowds either too frightened or too hungry not to worship the young king. He was a monster, but for many common folk, monstrous kings sometimes seemed no different than any other king. Yet for Sansa, tomorrow carried more meaning than it would for anyone else in the city. Tomorrow might be the day she finally took control of her own fate. She allowed her eyes to wander over the chipped rim of the mirror she had used for the past year to watch her own face become harder and more guarded. When she'd first come to King's Landing, she had tried so earnestly to be a perfect lady. Polite, graceful, a credit to her house. But perfection had earned her nothing but torment from Joffrey. From the moment he had seized her father and later taken his head, Sansa's illusions had shattered like a crystal goblet dropped on marble. She had learned that songs lied, that knights were not always gallant, that queens could be cruel, that the world rarely matched the bright illusions she had once harbored in her childhood fantasies at Winterfell. She ran a brush through her auburn hair, looking at herself in the mirror as if trying to identify the girl who was once betrothed to Joffrey. She saw only a stranger. Her eyes were still blue, her hair still thick and shimmering in the lantern light, but everything else about her felt remade. She set the brush down, heart pounding. In the corner of the vanity drawer was a small, hidden compartment that her maid had once shown her unwittingly. A trembling breath left her. She pulled it open, revealing a tiny glass vial no larger than her pinky finger, swirling with a clear liquid that caught the lamplight in a glimmering swirl. She did not know the name of the poison. She had not asked. She dared not. It had come by way of a whisper in a corridor. A package slipped between the folds of her gown. She had contemplated throwing it away, burying it in the gardens, or tossing it from the highest parapet into Blackwater Bay. But she had not. Some part of her, an unfamiliar cold kernel of defiance, had kept it. And as she'd laid awake night after night, recalling bruises from Joffrey's grip on her arm and the terror of living under his mother's watchful, suspicious gaze, an idea had rooted in her mind. She had always been powerless here. She had watched people she cared about disappear or perish, and she had seen Joffrey's cruelty become more reckless by the day. Perhaps it was time to embrace the darkness that had taken root in her. If she could be the one to end his cruelty, if she could sever this chain binding her to the Lannisters, would the gods forgive her? Would she even care if they did not? She pressed the vial between her fingers, feeling the faint ridges of glass. Tomorrow, at the wedding feast, there would be one moment when she'd have access to Joffrey's goblet. Perhaps when he demanded she serve him wine. She remembered how he had forced Tyrion to serve him at his name-day feast. Joffrey delighted in humiliating people he viewed as lesser, and Sansa was no longer his betrothed, but still his subject of torment. It was quite likely he would call her forward, laughing in that shrill way of his, and say, "My lady, pour me more wine." That would be her moment. Her stomach churned. She pushed the drawer closed. She could scarcely believe she was even considering it. But there was no turning back now. That night, she did not sleep. She lay on her back, hands folded across her stomach, eyes fixed on the ceiling. She whispered prayers, but they were not the meek, desperate ones she used to offer. She prayed to the old gods for strength, if they could hear her in this foreign south. She prayed to the new gods for mercy upon her soul. Whether they would grant it or not, she did not know. Then she prayed to whomever else might listen. Let Joffrey's tyranny end. Morning arrived with sun streaming through the window, accompanied by a bustling rush of handmaidens. They clothed her in a gown of pale green trimmed with silver, an odd color for a wedding, but she had no say in her wardrobe these days. She felt the glass vial tucked in a secret pocket she had sewn inside the dress. Pressed lightly against her hip, she clenched her jaw, a swirl of fear threatening to overtake her. She steeled herself, summoning the calm she had learned to display over the last 2 years. She could not waver. Not now. The city roared with celebration for the union of House Baratheon, in truth, House Lannister and House Tyrell. The great September of Baelor's bells rang out, and a warm breeze from the sea drifted in, carrying the odor of salt and fish that had turned rancid in the heat. The wedding ceremony was a formal pageant. Sansa lingered among the noble spectators, too far back to see the bride and groom clearly, but not too far to hear Joffrey's voice bouncing off the walls of the great September occasionally. She imagined what this day would have been like had she remained betrothed to him. How she would have walked the aisle, trembling at each step, trying to hide her fear behind a plastered smile. She was glad she had been set aside, even if it was for a girl he considered more worthy of forging an alliance with the Tyrells. Sansa realized with a flicker of astonishment that she no longer felt envy. Marriage to that boy was not something any woman should envy. After the vows were exchanged, and the High Septon blessed the union, the throng of lords and ladies streamed out to the courtyard where a parade of lavish carriages awaited to take them to the feast. Sansa followed in silence, gliding through the crowd as gracefully as she could. She caught a glimpse of Marjorie's triumphant face. Marjorie wore a mask of radiant joy, but Sansa wondered if the new queen's heart fluttered with doubt at her new husband's cruelty. Marjorie was cunning and seemed confident in her own ability to manage Joffrey. Perhaps she believed she could tame him. She would soon find out how impossible that task was. The wedding feast sprawled across the royal courtyard, an opulent display of color and sound. Silk banners of crimson and gold hung from every parapet, flapping in the breeze. The wedding tables groaned under the weight of roast boar, glossy with honey and apples, lemon cakes stacked in pyramids, and fresh fruits brought from Highgarden's orchards. Musicians plucked strings and blew into pipes, filling the air with cheerful tunes that tried to mask the tension swirling around the Lannisters' table. Sansa spotted Cersei Lannister seated near her father, Tywin, both wearing matching sets of disapproving, hawkish eyes. Oberyn Martell, the Prince of Dorne, was there as well, leisurely sipping from a cup and casting sidelong glances at the Lannisters. The Tyrell clan bustled among themselves at their table. Mace Tyrell, Marjorie's father, was practically glowing with pride. At the center of it all was King Joffrey, perched beside his bride, a golden crown on his head set with black onyx. He was shouting for entertainment. He demanded dwarfs do a reenactment of some great battle, something that Sansa knew would degrade the memory of her family yet again. She forced her gaze away, searching for Tyrion. The imp stood off to one side, shifting uncomfortably, forced into the role of master of the royal purse and overshadowed by his nephew King's antics. Sansa took a seat at a table designated for the ladies of the court, close enough to see the royal table, yet not so close that she would be forced into the conversation. Her heart thundered under her bodice. She kept one hand on the hidden pocket. The dwarfs' mock battle began, and the crowd erupted in raucous laughter. Joffrey cackled, slapping his knee with amusement, while Marjorie pretended to enjoy the show. Sansa felt her jaw tighten. Every nerve in her body was alive with tension. The time was drawing near. She could sense it. She considered the plan. She needed to slip the poison into his goblet when no eyes were upon her. But how could she manage that in full view of the entire court? She felt beads of sweat collecting at her hairline. Panic threatened to take her. Then, as if to quell the god's suspense, Joffrey stood and beckoned to her with an imperious flick of his hand. The moment she had dreaded and hoped for had arrived. She moved toward the dais, forcing her face into that demure expression she had perfected. Joffrey's grin was malevolent. "Lady Sansa," he called, "come pour wine for your once-betrothed king." She lowered her gaze, curtsying gracefully, while the onlookers quietly took note of this new humiliation. His voice rang over the crowd. "You do remember how to serve wine, don't you? You had plenty of practice serving my Uncle Tyrion." The court erupted with snickers and scattered applause. She approached the large golden chalice, the king's personal cup, which had been recently emptied into his mouth while he laughed at the dwarfs. She could see the droplets of red still clinging to the sides. A young serving girl offered her a decanter of Arbor Gold, a sweet white wine. Sansa's hand twitched at her side, brushing against the pocket containing the vial. Time slowed. She took the decanter with her left hand, clasping the underside of the chalice with her right. In that blink of an instant, she felt the glass vial warm against her hip. She had practiced how she would do it in her mind, but there was no room for error. She tilted the chalice just enough, letting her hand slip into the pocket and retrieve the tiny poison. The servant girl was busy holding the decanter, waiting to pass it to Sansa, and the crowd was half-focused on the comedic dwarfs who were still vying for attention. Her fingers were steady. She slipped the vial into the chalice, tipping it completely upside down. She felt it drain, watched as it vanished into the remnants of the red wine that pooled in the bottom. Her heart beat so loudly that she was certain Joffrey, or everyone in the courtyard, could hear it. In that same smooth motion, she accepted the arbor gold from the serving girl, filled the chalice to the brim, and waited to see if any witness gasped or pointed. No one did. The dwarfs banged their wooden swords together. The crowd roared, and Joffrey's eyes were on the humiliating spectacle. Finally, she placed the chalice before him with trembling hands, lowering her head in a deep bow. Joffrey took the goblet without a second glance in Sansa's direction. "Ah, the sweetest vintage for the sweetest king," he said in a self-congratulatory tone. He took a deep sip, then another, licking his lips and turning back to the dwarfs. Sansa felt faint. She retreated step by step, forcing herself not to look guilty, not to run, not to show any emotion. She took her seat again, folded her hands in her lap. The entire scene blurred around her. Her mind raced with the reality of what she had just done. She had poured poison into his cup. Kingslaying, regicide, a crime that would doom her entire life if discovered. She tried not to tremble. She told herself she was already doomed. She was a prisoner of the Lannisters with no hope of rescue. Winterfell was burned, her family scattered or dead. This was the only path left. Marjorie leaned toward Joffrey, presenting him with a new dish, a gilded chalice of thick stew from Highgarden's kitchens, while her grandmother, Olenna Tyrell, patted her granddaughter's shoulder. Sansa blinked, uncertain if Lady Olenna suspected anything, but the Tyrell matriarch's face was as calm as a statue. Joffrey ate, drank, and bantered with his guests, occasionally commanding the dwarfs to strike more ridiculous poses. Minutes passed in excruciating stillness for Sansa. She began to wonder if perhaps the poison was too weak or if she had received a faulty concoction. Suddenly, Joffrey coughed. A hush fell over those nearest him. A single cough would hardly draw attention, but then he coughed more violently. His face contorted with annoyance. He took another gulp of wine, expecting to quell the irritation in his throat, but it did not subside. He coughed harder, and now a hush spread across the courtyard. Heads began to turn. Marjorie stiffened beside him. Another harsh, ragged cough tore from Joffrey's throat, and his goblet slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the table. Wine sloshed over the edges. Cersei, alarmed, rose halfway from her seat. Her lips parted, but she remained uncertain whether to move toward him. Joffrey tried to speak, but only a strangled noise emerged. His eyes bulged, and his hand flew to his throat. Sansa watched, her heart hammering. It was terrifying to witness, more violent than she had imagined. She glanced around. If even one set of eyes spotted her tension, her panic, it would be over. She forced herself to mirror the expressions of the other onlookers. Confusion, worry, horror. When Joffrey reached out for help, toppling the table, the guests recoiled in alarm. The dwarfs and their comedic staging were forgotten. The music screeched to a halt. "Joffrey!" Cersei shrieked, rushing forward. Tywin stood slowly, face stern, while Jaime Lannister forced his way through the crowd to reach his son, though he would never publicly call him that. Sansa saw the Hound among the Kingsguard pushing forward, and Tyrion had stumbled to the dais. As well, an expression of pure shock etched on his face. Joffrey crumpled to his knees on the dais, retching, his face growing an alarming shade of purple. He spat out flecks of food and wine. The courtyard erupted in chaos. Some guests rose to see what was happening, Others shrank back in terror, and a few screamed, uncertain of what to do. Marjorie stared with wide eyes, pressing a hand to her lips. Cersei gathered Joffrey in her arms, oblivious to decorum, while Joffrey clawed at her gown, his nails scratching her skin. She cried out in panic, tears already pouring down her cheeks. "Help him!" she shouted, voice echoing in the courtyard. "Somebody help my son!" The king's personal maester stumbled forward, frantically rummaging in his bag. He tried to pry Joffrey's mouth open, but the boy's jaw locked in spasms. Joffrey's breath came in ragged, ugly chokes, and his eyes rolled back until they saw only white. The crowd watched in horror as King Joffrey Baratheon, first of his name, convulsed in his mother's arms. Sansa did not dare blink. The moment stretched on and on, a flash of pandemonium that felt both too quick and too long. Then, with one final shuddering breath, Joffrey's body went limp against Cersei. She wailed like a wounded animal, hugging him to her as though she could will life back into his frame. Purple foam oozed from his mouth. The king was dead. An eerie silence clung to every corner of the courtyard. Every lord, every lady, every guard, every minstrel. No one breathed. Tywin Lannister strode forward, a mask of stone, and put a hand on Cersei's shoulder. The Queen Mother threw back her head and screamed her grief, a raw, primal sound that seemed to echo up the walls of the Red Keep. Sansa remained still, her hands clasped, her face cold with the shock of what she had done. She felt a swirl of triumph, horror, and fear. The poison had done its work, and now there was no turning back. It was not long before the chaos erupted. Suddenly, soldiers seized Tyrion. Cersei shouted, "He did this! Seize my brother!" He handed Joffrey the cup. "He's the one!" The gold cloaks surged forward, manhandling Tyrion. He shouted his innocence, but it fell on deaf ears. Sansa felt her stomach turn at the injustice. Tyrion was being blamed, but of course he was. He had been the one closest to Joffrey, the one forced to serve as cupbearer earlier, the one Joffrey despised. The perfect scapegoat for Cersei's wrath. Sansa shrank back. If she stayed, she would be next. She had no illusions about how gentle Cersei's interrogations could be. Even if she was not under immediate suspicion, it was only a matter of time before the Lannisters, or their spies, dredged up every detail of the feast and realized Sansa had taken part in serving him that final cup of wine. She moved through the crowd in a daze, stepping over toppled chairs and spilled food, hearing the wails and urgent voices. She saw Lady Olenna with her arms around Marjorie, who looked stunned, tears in her eyes for the husband she never truly knew. She saw Baelish's mocking expression in her mind, though she could not actually spot him in the throng. She slipped away like a shadow, leaving the courtyard. No one noticed her go. Everyone's attention was riveted on Joffrey's corpse, lying in a tangle of royal finery in his mother's arms. Sansa's breath came in shallow gasps as she made her way toward her chamber. Servants were already buzzing through the halls, the news traveling like wildfire. "The king is dead!" She heard a sob from one direction, exclamations of shock from another, hurried footsteps on stone. She forced herself to walk quickly but not to run. In her room, she collected a small bundle she had prepared days before. It held a pair of sturdy shoes, a cloak with a hood, and a few coins in a simple linen pouch. Her wedding gown to Tyrion, unused for any real purpose, hung in the corner, a mocking reminder of the many humiliations she had suffered. She ignored it, heart pounding, and shrugged into the cloak. Tyrion's face flickered in her mind. She felt a pang of guilt at leaving him to take the blame for her deed. But there was no other way. She had to save herself, or she would be undone just as surely as he would be. A small chest in the corner contained a silver-haired net Baelish had once gifted her. Its significance had been unclear, and she had never dared to wear it. She left it behind, uncertain why she bothered to glance at it. There was no time for sentimentality. She made her way to the corridor, slipping down side passages, heading for the postern gate she had overheard the guards mention once. It was seldom used, overshadowed by the main gates leading to the docks, but that meant fewer guards. If she could slip out there, she might find passage on a boat or hide in Flea Bottom until she could plot her next move. She reached the gate without challenge, but the path was blocked by 2 gold cloaks, each clutching a spear. They were talking about the news, looking rattled. She pressed herself against the wall of an alcove, listening. "The king choked to death, they're saying," murmured one. "Or maybe he was poisoned. They're taking the imp gods save him. Queen Cersei is out of her mind with grief." "A dark day," the other responded. "Best keep our heads down. The Lannisters will be on a rampage soon enough." Sansa inhaled slowly. She studied their stance. They seemed too preoccupied to notice a figure creeping up on them. But how could she get past? She scanned the area, found a small side door that led to a storeroom, possibly a path around the gate. She slipped inside, discovering piles of unused barrels and crates. The air smelled of dust and stale grains. At the far end, she noticed a barred window that overlooked a narrow alley. If she could push through, she might drop into the alley unseen. She tested the window. It creaked, the bar heavy, but she wedged it open enough to slip through. The drop to the alley was not insignificant, perhaps a full story, but there were crates stacked below. She landed with a grunt, scraping her palms on the rough wood. Pain shot through her knees. She quickly glanced around. No one was there. King's Landing's labyrinthine streets spread out before her. The sun was sinking in the west, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink that were almost serene, belying the turmoil in the castle behind her. The city had not yet realized its king was dead, or if some had heard, they did not believe it. She could not stay in the alley for long. Gulping down the city's stale air, she pulled the hood over her hair. She had no illusions that she would pass easily as a commoner. Her posture and clothing would give her away to an observant guard, but in the gathering dusk, perhaps she could manage for a short time. She wove through narrow alleys, ignoring the catcalls from a pair of drunk men near a tavern's back entrance. She kept her eyes down, cloak drawn. She had no plan beyond escape. That gnawing guilt over Tyrion returned, but she pushed it away. She could not help him, not now, perhaps not ever. The Lannisters would be out for blood, and blame would fall on him completely. If she stayed, she would be next. If she was gone, maybe he would manage to prove his innocence, though she suspected it was unlikely. Still, that small hope was all she could cling to. Night draped King's Landing, the streets growing quieter except for the usual nighttime revelries of sailors and cut-purses. Sansa found the mud gate. She recalled that the city's wharves and docks lay beyond it, where she might find a ship headed anywhere else. Anywhere but here. She approached a pair of guards, who stood lazily by the gatehouse. She was about to slip by when one of them grabbed her arm. "Oi, what's your rush?" he demanded. Sansa's heart lurched. He was a tall man, unshaven, with yellowish teeth. He peered at her hooded face suspiciously. She lowered her voice. "My father's ill and I need to get home," she murmured, trying to sound frightened but not overly so. "Where's home?" the guard asked with a smirk. The other guard watched with mild curiosity. She swallowed. "Across the river," she lied, not really sure how to talk her way out. "I mean to get a ferry." His grip tightened. "Too late for ferries, girl. Better go back where you came from." He pulled her hood down slightly, revealing a glimpse of her pale face and auburn hair. Recognition did not immediately spark in his eyes, but suspicion deepened. "You're a little too well-fed for some dockside whelp. Show me your face." She panicked, but before he could yank the hood fully away, a shout came from behind. "We've orders. Check every traveler leaving the city. By the Queen's command. The King's been murdered." The second guard stiffened at the cry, and the first man's attention wavered just enough. Sansa acted on instinct, twisting her arm free and making a break for it. The guard cursed and stumbled, giving her a moment to dash down a narrow side street that skirted the gate. She heard them shouting, but in the darkness, she knew King's Landing better than they might suspect. She had spent countless hours wandering it in her imagination, planning escapes. Her feet carried her past shuttered stalls, into a labyrinth of tight alleyways. She vaulted over broken crates, ignoring the tears in her gown. Her breath came in ragged gasps. At last, she slid into a deserted courtyard behind an abandoned shop. There was no sign of the guards. She crouched behind a pile of broken bricks, trembling with fatigue and adrenaline. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled. Footsteps echoed on stone. She tried to calm her breathing, certain that if any gold cloak found her, it would be the end. She heard a soft voice from the shadows. "You chose a bold night to go for a stroll, my lady." Her heart leapt into her throat. From behind a broken wall stepped Petyr Baelish, cloaked in black, a mocking half-smile on his lips. He inclined his head, as though greeting her at a court function. "Did you think you could leave King's Landing without a friend?" he asked. "I suppose you must have known you needed one." Sansa tensed. Baelish was the last person she wanted to see, but also perhaps the only person who might help her. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, not daring to speak louder. He spread his hands in a gesture of mild offense. "Why, I might ask you the same. The city is in uproar, the king lying dead in his mother's arms. And here you are, wandering dark alleys like a lost kitten. If someone found you, they'd hardly believe you were innocent. Then again, we both know the truth is rarely so simple." He knew. Sansa's blood ran cold. The cunning gleam in his eye confirmed it. Did he know she had administered the poison, or did he only suspect? She tried to gauge his expression, but Baelish was a master of masks. "Come," he said softly, beckoning. "I have a little ship waiting at the quay. I've been making preparations for your liberation from the capital. I had thought to whisk you away quietly, but events have forced our hand. If you stay, you know what fate awaits. If you come with me, you'll be free of the Lannisters once and for all. It's as simple as that." She hesitated. Petyr Baelish was not a man she trusted. He had once been her mother's suitor, or so the rumors went, and he seemed to have an unhealthy interest in Sansa herself. But the alternative was wandering the city alone until the gold cloaks seized her. She did not see another option. Clutching her cloak tight, she nodded. He offered his arm in an oddly gallant gesture, and she refused it, stepping away from him. He shrugged, unoffended. "As you wish. Follow me." They picked their way through the alley until they reached a side dock along the Blackwater Rush, where a lone skiff waited. Two silent men sat at the oars, neither wearing any house sigil. Baelish handed the men a small pouch, likely coins, and helped Sansa aboard, then climbed in himself. The men rowed with practiced efficiency. The moonlight illuminated the bay, glinting on the water. King's Landing slowly fell behind them, the red keep's silhouette rising against the starry sky. Bells still rang in chaotic intervals, signifying the king's death. Smoke from the city's chimneys lingered in the air, but here on the water, the salt wind brushed Sansa's cheek, offering a semblance of relief. She stared back at the castle on the cliff, thinking of Joffrey's twisted, dead face. She felt a stirring of guilt, but also a sense of fierce relief. Baelish spoke quietly, leaning close. "I knew you were capable of surprising things, my dear Sansa, but even I didn't quite expect such boldness. The king's wedding feast, no less, a masterstroke of timing." She bit her lip, pretending she did not understand. "I don't know what you mean," he chuckled. "Of course you don't. We are simply two travelers fleeing a dangerous city." He leaned back, letting the subject drop. Sansa wrapped her cloak tighter around herself, the cold night wind chilling her sweaty skin. They transferred to a modest ship waiting in deeper water, a small merchant cog that could blend easily with countless others in the trade lanes. Baelish led her aboard, where a short, balding captain eyed them nervously. Without preamble, Baelish took Sansa to a cramped cabin in the hold, furnished with a narrow cot and a single lantern swaying from the rafters. "Not the comfortable bedchamber you're used to, but it's safe," he said. "We sail soon. Rest if you can." Before he could leave, Sansa spoke in a low voice, her nerves fraying. "Where will we go?" He regarded her with a slight smile. Far from here, somewhere the Lannisters have less power. You're a valuable young woman, Sansa. I have resources, contacts. All will be well." Then he closed the door, leaving her alone. She slumped onto the cot, listening to the groan of the ship's timbers. Her stomach churned, and she pressed a hand against it, wondering if she would be sick from the rocking motion or from the enormity of her actions. She had killed a king. She expected to feel triumphant, but in truth, she felt hollow, as though the only real effect was a deeper sense of alienation from the person she once was. She had wanted Joffrey dead for what he had done. Her father, her family, the humiliation, the fear, but still she had ended a life. She tried to focus on the future, on being free, on not being toyed with anymore. Perhaps in time she would learn to live with it. The ship set sail under cover of darkness, and by morning, King's Landing was a distant memory on the horizon. Sansa had no illusions that the Lannisters would stop searching for her. She imagined the city in chaos. Cersei in a fury, Tyrion languishing in a dungeon, the Tyrells reeling from the sudden shift of power. Tommen Baratheon, Joffrey's younger brother, would likely be crowned next, manipulated by Tywin and Cersei, but King's Landing would never be the same. Days passed in a blur of sea spray and subdued tension aboard the ship. Baelish's men navigated carefully, avoiding well-traveled naval routes. Sansa spent most of her time in her cramped cabin, emerging only to take quick meals of salted fish and biscuits. She rarely spoke to the crew, and they rarely acknowledged her. Baelish visited her daily, bringing bits of news gleaned from ravens or from passing ships. He reported the swirl of rumors. Some said Tyrion Lannister had conspired with his wife, Sansa Stark, to poison Joffrey. Others whispered it was a plot by the Tyrells, though the official line from the Queen Mother was that it was entirely Tyrion's doing. Yet Sansa was suspected of complicity. A bounty had been placed upon her. Her name and description would soon be spread across the Seven Kingdoms. Baelish delivered all of this with a calm, analyzing tone, as though discussing a well-played game of Cyvasse. Sansa listened numbly. Her name was now infamous. At last, Baelish announced they would soon make landfall at a small port along the Straits of Tarth. There, they would transfer to a smaller vessel bound for the Vale of Arryn. Lady Lysa Arryn, her maternal aunt, was Baelish's next target for alliances. Sansa dreaded seeing her aunt. She had only faint childhood memories of Lysa, but she had heard unsettling rumors of her paranoia and instability. Still, it was a place away from Lannister Reach, high in the mountains. She tried to gather her composure, remembering the meticulous courtesy she had learned in King's Landing. If her only sanctuary lay with her aunt, she would have to play the gracious niece. She would have to be cunning if she wanted to survive. They reached the Vale in a matter of weeks, traveling overland after docking in Gulltown. The Vale's mountainous passes were treacherous, but Baelish assured her that Lady Lysa would welcome them warmly, especially now that he came with her niece in tow. Sansa kept her identity concealed from curious onlookers. They traveled under the pretense that she was Baelish's young ward, Elaine Stone, a bastard girl from the Fingers. It was humiliating, but she saw no choice. She wore a dark hood at all times, and Baelish's retinue was small but efficient, warding off bandits with ease. At last, the Eyrie towers appeared, perched high atop a stone pinnacle. Sansa shivered in the cold mountain air. Memories of the cold in Winterfell flooded her senses. This place was not home, but it had a wintry austerity that seemed more familiar than the scorching sun of King's Landing. They ascended the winding path to the Gates of the Moon, then took the dizzying climb up the narrow stone steps to reach the castle proper, perched upon its lofty perch in the sky. Lady Lysa greeted them in the high hall, her eyes rimmed with weariness and suspicion. But the moment she saw Sansa's face, everything shifted. "My dear niece," she said in a breathy voice, rushing forward with outstretched arms. Sansa forced a smile, letting her aunt hug her. Lysa was all frantic energy, grasping Sansa's shoulders and studying her features. "You've grown so much. Oh, you look so much like Kat when she was your age." She stepped back, her gaze flicking to Baelish. A trace of jealousy swam there, but then she turned back to Sansa. You must be exhausted from your journey. Come, rest. You are safe here, safe from the Lannisters, safe from the world." Sansa allowed herself to be led deeper into the Eyrie. The corridors were drafty, the wind whistling through narrow windows, but it felt less stifling than the Red Keep's corridors. Lysa was eager to show her the high hall, with its famous moon door, a narrow opening in the floor leading to a sheer drop miles below. Sansa tried to hide her terror at that lethal door. A single push would send someone plunging into empty air. She forced a polite smile and listened as Lysa spoke of the dangers beyond the Vale's borders, how the mountains protected them from invaders, how they would never yield to the Iron Throne. Later that evening, Sansa sat alone in a small solar assigned to her. She looked out the arched window at the jagged peaks and the swirling clouds below. The sense of distance was overwhelming. She thought of King's Landing, the swirl of treachery and opulence. She thought of the dark deed she had performed. She touched her hands together, remembering the glass vial. She felt the weight of it, though it was long gone. Suddenly, the door opened, and Peter slipped inside. He closed it behind him gently. She rose at once, on edge. He gave her a thin smile. "You're safe, my dear. Please sit." Sansa sat again, watching him warily. He stepped toward the window, peering out into the cold night. "Lady Lysa can be difficult," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But she is pliable enough if properly handled. I will soon wed her as I've planned. With the Vale secured, we will have a stronghold against any Lannister pursuit." She swallowed. Wed her? She had known rumors of his interest in Lysa. Still, the reality startled her. He shrugged. "I need her, Sansa, and you need the protection this castle offers. Once Tommen is crowned, the Lannisters will have all the resources of the Iron Throne at their disposal to find you, especially if Tyrion confesses or is found guilty. Cersei will want you alive, or perhaps only your head, to avenge her precious son." His tone was sharp with sarcasm. "Better for you to be safe here, among your mother's kin. I will do everything I can to protect you." She did not thank him. Her gratitude for Baelish was complicated by mistrust and the sense that he saw her as another piece on his board. "What if they come? Will the Vale go to war on my behalf?" Baelish laughed softly. "The Vale will do what I guide it to do through your aunt. And you, my dear, will remain our sweet Elaine Stone. No one shall know that Sansa Stark is hidden away in these mountains. Eventually, the search will die down, the realm will move on. The Lannisters have many enemies. Each day brings fresh strife. In time, your role in this tragedy may fade to a rumor." Sansa nodded, though she was not entirely convinced. The name Sansa Stark was already whispered as Joffrey's murderer in many corners of the Seven Kingdoms, if Baelish's reports were true. But she realized time could dull the memory. If the War of the Five Kings had taught her anything, it was that the realm was perpetually hungry for new gossip. Joffrey's death might become old news, overshadowed by new calamities, especially if Tywin Lannister turned his focus toward the Iron Bank of Bravos or the continuing rebellions in the Riverlands. She recalled Tyrion's face. She recalled the look of shock and horror that had settled there as the guards seized him. A flicker of remorse scorched her heart. He had been kind to her, or at least kinder than most Lannisters. He did not deserve this. Yet she had set these events in motion. "What will happen to Tyrion?" she asked quietly. Baelish studied her for a moment. "He stands accused of regicide. Cersei demands his head. He will likely stand trial. He may fight it, call for a trial by combat. He's cunning and resourceful, but King's Landing is a pit of lions, and he is but one lion among many." He paused. "His chances are slim, Sansa." She felt tears burning behind her eyes. "He is innocent," she whispered. Baelish's voice was soft, but he gave a knowing smile. "Is he?" He offered nothing more. She turned away, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. In a strange way, she realized that Baelish knew exactly who had poured the poison, and yet he took some satisfaction in it. Perhaps he would use that knowledge to manipulate her. Fear coiled in her belly, but she steeled herself. She had made the choice to kill Joffrey. She had chosen to flee. She was alive, but her life was no longer hers. It was tangled in the webs of Baelish and Lysa, in the shadow of her own guilt. For weeks afterward, she lived in the Eyrie under the guise of Elaine Stone. She dressed in simpler gowns than she had worn in King's Landing, her hair concealed whenever guests or soldiers passed through. Lysa introduced her to her sickly cousin, Lord Robert Arryn, a boy prone to fits of weeping and trembling, who clung to his mother's skirts. Sansa found him trying, but she hid her irritation behind a veneer of gentle courtesy. Occasionally, ravens arrived from the outside world, carrying news of Tyrion's trial. The details were horrifying. Cersei had gathered a parade of witnesses to slander him. She had convinced Shae, Tyrion's lover, to testify against him, painting him as a monster who had colluded with Sansa to murder the king. The trial seemed a farce, orchestrated to guarantee his conviction. Baelish relayed these tidbits with a cool detachment. Sansa found herself growing ill at the thought of it all, but she had no power to stop it. One afternoon, after a frigid morning of pacing the halls, Sansa stood by a window overlooking the Vale's jagged cliffs. The sky was a bright, cloudless blue, the sunlight bouncing off the snowy peaks. It was beautiful and daunting all at once. She felt a stab of longing for Winterfell, for her family. She thought of her younger sister, Arya, somewhere out there, perhaps. She thought of Bran and Rickon, rumored dead, but was there hope they might still live? She thought of Jon at the wall. She felt more alone than ever. Baelish found her there, approaching with careful steps. "You have a visitor," he said in a careful tone. She looked at him, alarmed. "Who?" "Your aunt. But I expect that she wants answers." He gave her a faint smile. "Play the part of the dutiful niece. She's unpredictable when she feels threatened." Sansa followed him to the small audience chamber where Lysa sat perched upon a cushioned chair, tapping her fingers on the armrest. She motioned for Sansa to approach. Baelish lingered behind, close enough to intervene if needed. Lysa's blue eyes fixed on Sansa. "My dear, do you have any idea how the rumors swirl? Some lords whisper that you had a role in that boy king's death. You would not lie to your aunt, would you?" Her voice was sweetly menacing. Sansa's throat constricted, but she recalled how to feign innocence from her time in King's Landing. "I had no part in it, Aunt Lysa. I was terrified, that was all. I fled because they blamed me or suspected me, and I knew I would be executed. I was helpless. I did not kill Joffrey." The lie slid from her tongue like ice water. She dared not glance at Baelish. Lysa studied her intently. Sansa forced tears to gather in her eyes. "He was a monster," she whispered, letting real emotion color her words. "But I am not a murderer. Please, Aunt Lysa, you must believe me." The older woman's expression softened. She reached out, patting Sansa's hand. "I believe you, dear. That Lannister scum would blame anyone to save themselves." She paused, and her eyes flicked to Baelish, jealousy simmering beneath her gaze. "You belong here, safe with family. Soon, Peter and I will be wed, and we shall protect you. The Vale stands alone, untouchable by the intrigues of King's Landing." Sansa nodded gratefully, putting on a mask of relief. "Thank you." She withdrew her hand gently. Lysa smiled a thin, reedy smile, rising from her seat. She shot Baelish a look that Sansa did not fully understand, a mixture of desire and suspicion, before sweeping from the room. When they were alone, Baelish exhaled, crossing his arms. "Well done. She believes you, or at least she's content to believe you for now." Sansa could only nod, her nerves still jangling. She saw how precarious her position was. If Lysa ever decided that Sansa was a threat to her relationship with Baelish, she could cast her out or toss her through the moon door without a second thought. Sansa realized that the game she played in the Eyrie was every bit as dangerous as the one in King's Landing. But at least she was alive. Weeks bled into months. Reports trickled in. Tyrion demanded a trial by combat. Cersei named Ser Gregor Clegane as her champion. Prince Oberyn Martell volunteered as Tyrion's champion, seeking vengeance against the Mountain for what had happened to his sister. Sansa clutched each rumor with trembling hands, hoping that maybe Tyrion could be saved, or at least that the blame for Joffrey's death would be cast into question. Then came the devastating news that the Mountain had crushed Oberyn in the duel, that Tyrion had been found guilty of regicide, and that he had been sentenced to death. Sansa gasped when Baelish told her. She felt the breath leave her lungs. Tyrion was a dead man, condemned for a crime she had committed. She pressed her hand to her mouth. "He was my husband," she whispered. "I know he tried to be kind." Baelish's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. "Perhaps we should drink to the demise of yet another Lannister. But fear not, Tyrion may yet surprise us." She stared at him, not comprehending. "What do you mean?" His smile widened. "The imp is cunning, Sansa. Never underestimate a cornered man. Death sentences in King's Landing sometimes go awry, especially if you have gold or allies." She felt a jolt of sudden hope. Could Tyrion escape? She wanted to ask more, but Baelish would say nothing further, leaving her with a cryptic half-smile. She returned to her chamber, pacing back and forth. She could do nothing but wait and see what the next raven brought. Every day, she wondered if she would hear the news of Tyrion's execution. The guilt gnawed at her. One evening, Lisa invited her to watch the young Robert Arryn practice archery in the courtyard. The boy was shaky, complaining of the cold and the weight of the bow. Sansa offered gentle encouragement, channeling memories of how her own brothers had learned archery. Robert's arrow wobbled, clattering into the stone wall. He threw a tantrum, tears welling, and demanded that they do something more interesting. Lisa hurried to soothe him, cooing like a mother hen. Sansa excused herself, retreating to the vantage of a balcony overlooking the Vale's breathtaking drop. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in gold and red. Her thoughts drifted to that fateful moment with the chalice in hand. Could she have chosen differently? Should she have waited for fate to punish Joffrey in its own time? But she had been so desperate, so hopeless. She closed her eyes, breathing the thin air. She heard footsteps. Baelish joined her at the balcony, resting his arms on the cold stone parapet. For a moment, they watched the horizon in silence. Then he said softly, "Tyrion Lannister escaped." Her eyes snapped open. She turned to him. "How?" He smiled, proud in a way, as though he had orchestrated it. "It seems Lord Varys had a hand, perhaps Jaime Lannister as well. The official accounts are murky, but the imp slipped away in the dead of night. He killed his father, Tywin, before fleeing the city. Word is that Tywin was found dead on the privy with a crossbow bolt in him." Sansa's knees felt weak. Tyrion had escaped. He had killed his father? The labyrinth of betrayal in King's Landing was deeper than she had ever imagined. If Tyrion had truly fled, he might now be an outlaw in the eyes of the crown, the same as her. But at least he was alive. A wave of relief threatened to bring her to tears. She silently thanked the gods. Baelish seemed amused. Cersei is now truly bereft. Her son dead, her father dead. Her brother the Kingslayer is back but disgraced in her eyes. The new king, Tommen, is too young to truly command. The small council is in disarray. The realm may fracture further. Sansa gripped the cold stone. The Lannisters' hold might weaken? He inclined his head. Quite so, but don't imagine they're finished. A wounded lion can still lash out with deadly force. Cersei remains fiercely protective of what remains of her family. Her hatred for Tyrion is boundless, and her hatred for you may be just as strong if she ever discovers you truly did the deed. Sansa lowered her gaze. She believes Tyrion and I conspired, so in her mind, I am guilty either way. Indeed, Baelish said with a wry smile. But for now you're safe, and Tyrion is far from King's Landing, no longer a threat or a shield. He paused, studying her. I wonder if you're relieved. You've been so haunted by guilt, you've scarcely eaten. Sansa's cheeks burned. I do not wish him ill. No, and perhaps it's better this way. Baelish placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. She stiffened but did not pull away, too aware that to spurn him openly was dangerous. In any case, Sansa, the game continues with or without the Lannisters. In time, you may find your role changes again. She nodded, uncertain. She had never felt less in control of her own destiny. At night, she lay awake, the howling mountain winds rattling the shutters, as images of King Joffrey's final moments replayed in her head. She heard Cersei's screams, saw Tyrion's astonished face. Sometimes she dreamt of Ned Stark, her father, telling her not to lose herself in darkness. Other nights, she dreamt that Joffrey rose from his pyre and came for her, purple-faced and choking, accusing her of murder. In this suspended existence, days slipped past. Lysa and Baelish were hastily wed in a small ceremony, Robert Arryn dozing in a corner while the septon droned. Sansa watched, feeling numb, as her aunt beamed with a fragile, desperate joy at finally marrying the man she had loved for so long. Baelish offered a practiced smile, though his eyes occasionally flicked to Sansa. She pretended not to notice. Not long afterward, Lysa's jealous streak flared. She cornered Sansa in the high hall, ranting about how Sansa had stolen Baelish's affections. Her voice rose to a hysterical pitch, echoing off the stone walls. Sansa backed away toward the moon door, fear surging. Robert cowered behind a pillar, weeping at his mother's distress. Baelish rushed in, trying to calm Lysa, but her rage was unstoppable. She accused Sansa of flirting with her husband, of trying to supplant her in his bed. Sansa denied it in tears, trembling. Lysa grabbed her roughly by the shoulders and dragged her toward the moon door. A fierce wind blasted in from the open portal, whistling in the dizzying expanse. For a terrible moment, Sansa felt herself teetering on the brink of that endless drop. She let out a ragged scream. Baelish cried out, stepping in. He reached for Lysa, pulling her away from Sansa. "Let her go, my sweet wife," he said softly, cupping Lysa's face in his hands. She glared at him, tears streaking her cheeks, still trembling with jealous fury. "Why do you care for her?" Lysa demanded, her voice shrill. "Why?" Peter gave her a gentle, cajoling smile. "I only ever loved one woman." Lysa's face twisted in confusion, expecting him to say her name. But instead, he whispered, "Your sister, Catelyn." Then he shoved her through the moon door. Lysa's scream echoed as she plunged into the emptiness, vanishing from sight. Sansa collapsed to the floor, her heart hammering. Baelish stood at the edge, staring out the door where Lysa had disappeared. A gust of cold wind rushed in, stirring his cloak. Robert wailed in the corner, too shocked to comprehend what had happened. Baelish turned, extending a hand to Sansa. She gazed at him, horror fueling her numbness. He whispered, "Now the veil is mine, and you are safe once more." There was a chilling finality in his tone. Sansa realized that she was bound to him in secrets and murder. They were complicit, each having taken life to gain freedom or power. She let him help her stand, legs shaking. She peered out the moon door into the dark void. Another nightmare, another step away from who she had been. The next days were a frantic dance as Baelish maneuvered to secure his rule as Lord Protector of the Vale, forging alliances with the noble houses sworn to the Eyrie. He spun a tale of Lysa's suicide, blaming it on her unstable mind. Sansa was forced to corroborate, testifying that her aunt had been distraught. She donned the identity of Elaine Stone, Baelish's natural daughter, and the lords accepted it, more or less. They might suspect something darker, but Peter Baelish had a silver tongue and a cunning mind. She watched him manipulate the Lords Declarant, a group of Vale lords who demanded answers. Through skillful diplomacy and carefully placed bribes, he convinced them to leave Robert in his care. Sansa was introduced under her false identity, her hair darkened subtly with dye. Though there were suspicious glances, none dared openly challenge Baelish's word. For the moment, the Vale was locked away in its own concerns, with the rest of Westeros a distant worry. Sansa's life settled into a new, uneasy pattern. She tried to teach Robert how to be a proper lord, though he showed little interest. She saw how Baelish guided everything from the shadows, controlling the flow of ravens, the movements of soldiers, and the finances of the Eyrie. She tried not to dwell on the moral cost of what they had done. If Joffrey had lived, she reminded herself, he would have continued to hurt people, to wage war, to cause suffering. Lysa's madness would have threatened Sansa's life soon enough. She clung to these justifications, but at times she felt sick with shame. At night, she lay awake in a bed far colder than she'd known in the Red Keep, listening to the wind roar outside. She would trace the lines of the stone ceiling, thinking about how each decision she had made seemed to draw her further from the bright-eyed girl who once embroidered flowers and sang songs of chivalric romance. That girl was dead, left behind in King's Landing along with Joffrey's lifeless body. In her place was a young woman who had chosen to kill to save herself, who now wore a disguise in the Vale of Eyrie, who lived under the protection of a man she could not trust. Yet, she was alive, and free in ways she had not been in King's Landing. She did not fear Joffrey's next whim of cruelty. She was far from the eyes of Cersei and Tywin. She did not have to endure Marjorie's pity or the court's snickers. In the mornings, she stepped onto a small balcony overlooking a sea of clouds, letting the sun's warmth mingle with the cold mountain air. Sometimes, she found a fragile peace in the wind's howl. The Vale was a lonely place, but at least it was beautiful, untouched by the chaos of war for the moment. Soon enough, Baelish told her of new developments in the south. The Lannisters were tightening their control on King Tommen, forging alliances with the Tyrells still, but rumors of restlessness among the lords in the Riverlands continued. The Iron Bank of Bravos had grown impatient with the crown's debts. The north was in turmoil, with Bolton forces claiming control of Winterfell, though pockets of loyalists whispered the name Stark in hidden corners. Sansa yearned to ride north, to reclaim her home, to do something meaningful. But she understood how foolish it would be. She was a fugitive, a girl with no army, no power, reliant on Baelish's cunning to avoid being captured. Her mother and brother were dead, her younger siblings scattered. She reminded herself that if she died or was arrested, her line of House Stark would weaken further. If there was any chance of reuniting with her family, or of seeing Winterfell again, it would be through patience and cunning. So she poured her energies into learning the game from Baelish. She studied the letters he wrote, the deals he forged. He would quiz her at supper about the alliances in the Vale, the dealings with Bravos. At first, she resisted, but over time, she recognized that knowledge might be her only weapon. If she could become skilled in the art of politics, she might one day seize an opportunity to help her family or herself. The memory of how powerless she had been in King's Landing drove her to listen keenly. Baelish, for his part, seemed pleased. He would offer sly compliments, praising her intellect. At times, he tried to be fatherly, but she sensed the edge of something else in his eyes, a desire that made her skin crawl. She kept her guard up, offering polite deference, careful smiles, while never letting him close. She was determined not to be his pawn forever. As time drifted on, the Vale remained relatively peaceful, untouched by the major conflicts that plagued the rest of the realm. Merchants came and went, bringing tidings of assassinations, minor rebellions, and shifting alliances across the Seven Kingdoms. Sansa heard rumors of Tyrion's wanderings, how he had gone east, perhaps to Bravos or beyond, though no one knew for certain. She felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow at never seeing him again. She also learned that Brienne of Tarth, a loyal knight who had once sworn to her mother, might be searching for the Stark girls. This news stirred a little spark of hope. Perhaps Brienne would find Arya, or even come to the Vale. But Sansa was not certain she should be found. Not yet. If Cersei discovered her whereabouts, the Lannisters might come down on the Vale with brutal force. She vacillated, torn between hope for rescue and fear of it. One evening, Baelish joined her in the Solar, where she was reviewing a ledger of the Eyries' supplies. He sat beside her, too close. She forced herself not to move away abruptly. "You've grown quite adept at managing the castle's finances," he commented. "You remind me of your mother's keen mind." Sansa murmured, "I do my best." He traced a finger over the table's surface, watching her. The lords of the Vale are beginning to accept me as their lord protector. Soon we'll have stability here. Then we might consider expanding our influence." She looked at him warily. "What do you mean?" He gave her a cunning smile. "The north is in chaos under the Boltons. The Riverlands remain uncertain. The Lannisters, though weakened, still hold the throne. But everything changes, my dear. Winds shift. I have plans in motion, alliances to forge. And you, Sansa, are part of that future. One day we may see a Stark restored to Winterfell, and a Vale strong and prosperous at their side. Imagine it." Her heart twisted. She longed for that image, but she also knew Baelish always took more than he gave. She said nothing, only held his gaze. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I know you felt guilt for your role in Joffrey's demise, but let me remind you, that act opened many doors. It freed you, and it weakened the Lannisters. Whatever befalls Tyrion or the others, you must not regret that you seized your moment." Sansa closed her eyes briefly. His words contained a harsh truth. She had ended Joffrey's life to save herself. The consequences were vast, but she was indeed no longer Joffrey's plaything. She was forging a new path, however treacherous. She looked at Baelish again. "I only hope that one day the Starks might find justice," she said quietly. Baelish smiled. "Justice? In this world, my dear, we take what we can. Someday you may find that justice is only a word men use to cloak their ambitions. Remember that." She nodded slowly, absorbing his cynical lesson. In the months that followed, she honed her ability to read the expressions of the Vale's lords and ladies, practicing subtle manipulation of conversation as she tried to glean morsels of information. She wrote letters under Baelish's guidance, adopting the name Elaine Stone but quietly infusing them with the dignity of a highborn lady. She performed the role well. Some nights, she felt the ghost of who she once was haunting her in the mirror, but she told herself that girl was gone. Now she was someone else, for better or worse. Seasons changed. The Vale's snows deepened, and the Eyrie grew colder, though it remained passable through the stone walkway. Baelish periodically traveled down to the Gates of the Moon or to meet certain lords in secret, leaving Sansa behind to watch over Robert. She grew used to the daily routine, tutoring the sickly boy, overseeing the household's chores, dealing with servants who looked at her with curiosity or mild respect. Every so often, the memory of Joffrey's final choke rattled through her dreams. She would wake in a sweat, tears burning her eyes, and then swallow back the sorrow and remind herself that this was the price of survival. She had rid the world of a cruel king, yet she still felt as though her soul had been stained in the process. Word arrived that Margaery Tyrell had married Tommen, solidifying an alliance between Highgarden and the throne. Rumors abounded that Cersei was losing her grip, especially after Tywin's death. Some whispered that House Tyrell was the true power behind King Tommen now. Sansa had no tears for Cersei's plight, but she felt a distant sadness for Margaery, who had once tried to be kind to her. Now Margaery was bound to yet another young king, though Tommen was reportedly sweet and gentle, far from Joffrey's monstrous nature. Sansa hoped, for Margaery's sake, that Tommen would not turn cruel. Time rolled onward. Winter loomed, though the full force had not yet descended on Westeros. One evening, Sansa found herself alone in the Godswood of the Eyrie, a small, stunted place nestled in a courtyard open to the sky. A weirwood tree did not grow here, only a few barren oaks and pines, the soil too shallow for anything grand. But she needed the semblance of a sacred space. She knelt, breathing the cold mountain air, imagining the old gods could hear her from afar. She closed her eyes and whispered, "If you can hear me, watch over my siblings. Arya, Bran, Rickon, Jon, wherever they are, keep them safe. Watch over them better than you watched over me. Please." She paused, her throat tight. "And, for what I have done, I ask your forgiveness. I do not know if I deserve it. I only know that I am still a Stark, even if I must hide my name. That is all I have. Let me be strong." A breeze rustled the pine needles above, dusting her shoulders with a sprinkle of snow. She bowed her head, letting silent tears fall. She felt no immediate comfort, no sign from the gods. But in her heart, she clung to a shred of resolution. She would endure. She would live on, carrying the weight of her sins, if it meant one day reuniting with her family or reclaiming a measure of peace. Rising, she brushed snow from her skirt, her breath misting in the cold air. She walked back into the corridors lit with torches. Robert Arryn was somewhere inside, likely whining about dinner or complaining of a headache. Baelish would be in his solar, reading letters of the realm's latest machinations. Servants would hurry about, preparing the night's meal. The routine was unremarkable, yet there was safety in it. She passed a high, narrow window and glimpsed the endless valleys below, a fortress of stone and cloud protecting her from the outside world. And so she continued her life at the Eyrie as Elaine Stone, the secret murderer of King Joffrey Baratheon. She did not know what the future held. Perhaps one day, she would be forced to flee yet again. Perhaps war would sweep into the Vale, or the White Walkers of legend would descend from the far north, as old stories warned. Perhaps the Game of Thrones would bring a new champion or a new villain to her doorstep. But she knew one thing. No matter how lost she felt, she had taken a step to break the chains of her captivity. She had taken power into her own hands, however bloody. In doing so, she had etched a new path for herself, a path she would walk with caution and a fierce determination that, beneath her courtesies, kindled anew. If someday the name Sansa Stark rose to prominence again, it would be on her terms, and in memory of the girl she once was, and the direwolf she hoped to still become. She might never be a knight in shining armor, nor the princess of songs, but she would survive. And in a world of lions and vipers, of kings and traitors, perhaps survival, and the ability to shape her own destiny, was the greatest triumph of all.